Hello and welcome. You stand before a crumbling archway, its stones weathered by millennia of wind and rain, its surface covered in script you cannot read. The letters curve and spiral in patterns that suggest both beauty and power, yet their meaning has been lost to the ages. Your torch flickers against moss-covered walls, and you realize that this ruin, this forgotten entrance, once stood as the gateway to an empire that shaped the world you now explore. The dust beneath your boots was once polished marble where kings walked, where wizards demonstrated miracles, where priests channeled the raw power of their deities. Now, only silence answers your footsteps. The worlds of Dungeons and Dragons contain secrets that go far deeper than the deepest dungeon, mysteries that stretch back further than the oldest dragon's memory. You walk through landscapes shaped by civilizations that rose to heights of glory your own world can barely comprehend, only to collapse into dust and legend. These were not simple kingdoms ruled by a single monarch, not mere city-states competing for resources. These were empires that spanned continents, that touched other planes of existence, that challenged the gods themselves, and sometimes won. They commanded magic so profound that its echoes still reshape reality thousands of years after their fall. They built wonders that defy explanation, monuments that modern scholars can observe, but never truly replicate. When you discover a dungeon, when you venture into ruins seeking treasure and glory, you are walking through the remnants of these lost powers. The magical trap that nearly claims your life was placed by a civilization you have never heard of, crafted with techniques your world has forgotten. The artifact you seek, the legendary weapon or tome of forbidden knowledge, represents but a fragment of what these empires wielded in their daily affairs. What you consider world-shaking power was, to them, merely commonplace. The spell that modern archmages spend lifetimes mastering was taught to schoolchildren in their academies. The magical item that nations go to war over was mass-produced in their workshops and sold in common markets. Understanding these lost civilizations requires you to adjust your perspective on history itself. The world you adventure in did not begin with the kingdoms and nations you know. Your current age is built atop layers upon layers of previous ages, each more distant and more alien than the last. The continent of Faerûn, where so many adventures unfold, has been shaped and reshaped by countless empires. Mountains were raised, and valleys carved by magical conflicts, so vast they make modern wars seem like children's squabbles. Entire races were created, modified, enslaved, and freed in cycles that span tens of thousands of years. The very weave of magic, the fundamental force that makes spellcasting possible, bears the scars of ancient catastrophes. You might wonder why these mighty empires fell. If they commanded such power, if they achieved such heights of magical and cultural development, what force could possibly bring them low? The answer, you will discover, is never simple. Some civilizations destroyed themselves through hubris, reaching too far and grasping powers they could not control. Others fell to external threats, to invasions by forces from beyond their world, or to the wrath of deities they had offended. Many declined slowly, victim to internal corruption, decadence, or the simple weight of their own success. Some were betrayed by the very magic that made them great, discovering too late that certain powers carry prices too terrible to pay. The empire of Netheril reached into the heavens themselves, creating cities that floated among the clouds, held aloft by magic so powerful it seemed to mock the natural order. Their arcanists discovered secrets that allowed them to rival the gods in power. Yet, Netheril fell in a single day, brought low by one wizard's attempt to claim divinity for himself. The floating cities plummeted from the sky, killing millions in moments. The Anauroch Desert, that vast wasteland that dominates northern Faerûn, was created by Netheril's fall, transformed from fertile land into endless sand by the magical backlash of their empire's death. The Imiskari Empire ruled vast territories through a combination of artifice and portal magic that allowed them to project their power across impossible distances. They considered themselves masters of all reality, so confident in their supremacy that they kidnapped the deities of other peoples and held those gods prisoner. The Imiskari believed themselves above divine retribution, safe behind wards that blocked the gods from entering their realm. They were wrong. The gods found another path, one the Imiskari had never anticipated, and divine fury swept their empire into oblivion so complete that most modern scholars doubt the Imiskari ever existed at all. Mithrandir represented the highest ideals of elven civilization, a city where different races lived together in harmony, where magic and art flourished in equal measure, where the very streets were protected by mythals of such sophistication that modern magic seems crude by comparison. Yet Mithrandir fell to an army of demons, devils, and dark things from beyond the world. Overwhelmed despite all their power, because they could not imagine that evil might match them in determination and organization. The ruins of Mithrandir remain cursed and deadly, a testament to how completely glory can be transformed into horror. These patterns repeat throughout history, across different worlds and planes. The giant empire of Astoria dominated the northern lands when humans were little more than scattered tribes. The giants built monuments that still stand, created weapons that still function, established a social order that their descendants maintain, even in reduced circumstances. But Astoria fractured when the giant races turned on one another, when their own divisions proved stronger than their unity. The empire that once made dragons bow their heads collapsed into warring petty kingdoms, each giant race claiming supremacy while controlling only fragments of their ancestors' territory. You need to understand that these civilizations did not vanish without a trace. Their ruins dot the landscape, waiting for adventurers like you to explore them. Their magic still functions, sometimes in unpredictable or dangerous ways. Their knowledge remains recorded in ancient texts, hidden in libraries beneath mountains, or sealed in extra-dimensional vaults. Their descendants walk among the modern peoples, carrying memories and traditions from vanished glory days. The Warforged remember the empire that created them in distant Corvair. The Aasimar carry the blood of celestial powers that once walked the world openly. The Genasi bear elemental heritage from civilizations that trafficked with the inner planes. Every race, every nation can trace its lineage back to empires that once seemed eternal. Modern nations build their cities atop ancient foundations. The sewers beneath Waterdeep connect to deeper structures from previous ages. The catacombs under Baldur's Gate extend into complexes that predate human settlement of the Sword Coast by thousands of years. When you delve into these underground realms, you are not simply exploring storage spaces or drainage systems. You are descending through layers of history, each level representing a different age, a different civilization that rose and fell before making way for the next. Magic items from these lost empires possess qualities that modern enchantment cannot replicate. The techniques have been lost, the materials no longer exist, or the knowledge required such specialization that no living being commands it anymore. When you find a weapon bearing Netherese enchantments, you hold something that cannot be recreated by any wizard in your world, no matter how skilled or knowledgeable. The processes used to create such items depended on infrastructure, on networks of supporting magic, and specialized workshops that existed only in Netheral's floating cities. With those cities destroyed, with their libraries scattered, and most of their people dead, the knowledge vanished like smoke. The same holds true for architectural achievements. Modern engineers look upon certain ancient structures and cannot explain how they were built. The blocks are too massive to move with available technology. The precision of the stonework exceeds what current tools can achieve. The magical reinforcement operates on principles that contemporary magic theory does not recognize. These are not primitive works that later ages surpassed. These are sophisticated achievements that later ages cannot match. The fall of these empires represented genuine losses of knowledge, capabilities that will never be recovered, because the context that made them possible no longer exists. You might encounter curses that have outlasted the civilization that placed them by 5,000 years. These are not simple magical effects that a spell can dispel. These are fundamental alterations to reality itself, woven so deeply into the fabric of existence that they have become natural laws in their area of effect. The curse that keeps a particular forest perpetually shrouded in twilight was placed by an empire that fell before your ancestors learned to work bronze. Generations of wizards have tried to lift it and failed. The curse remains because it was never meant to be temporary. It was meant to last forever, and it very well might. Some lost civilizations left behind constructs and guardians that still fulfill their ancient purposes. Mechanical sentinels patrol ruins where no living being has walked for millennia, following programming or commands from masters who turned to dust ages ago. These constructs cannot be reasoned with, cannot be updated or reprogrammed. They know only their original instructions, and they will carry them out until they finally break down. Some have been active for so long that they have developed something approximating personality, quirks and behaviors born from thousands of years of following the same routines, yet they remain bound to their purpose, unable to conceive of existence beyond their assigned task. The political landscape of your world was shaped by these ancient empires in ways both obvious and subtle. Modern nations occupy territories that once belonged to older powers, and sometimes those older powers want their land back. The Shadowvar who returned from the plane of shadow believed they were reclaiming their rightful inheritance from Netheril. The fact that human kingdoms now ruled those lands meant nothing to them. They had been in exile for less than 2,000 years by their reckoning, merely a temporary setback. That the world had moved on without them, that new peoples had established their own legitimate claims to the territory, did not factor into their calculations. This led to conflicts that ravaged entire regions. Wars fought because one side refused to accept that history had continued during their absence. Religious institutions trace their authority back to divine mandates from ancient days. The gods established certain temples, blessed certain bloodlines, made certain promises when these lost empires still flourished. Those divine agreements remain in effect even though the empires that received them no longer exist. A modern priest might channel power through rituals established 10,000 years ago, speaking prayers in languages no living person understands, performing ceremonies whose original meaning has been forgotten, but whose efficacy remains undimmed. The gods remember even when mortals forget. Trade routes that modern merchants use were established by ancient empires, chosen for reasons that no longer apply. Perhaps the route avoided territory controlled by a rival nation that vanished 3,000 years ago. Perhaps it connected cities that are now ruins. Yet the route remains optimal because it was so well established, because so much infrastructure was built along its length. Wells were dug at regular intervals. Way stations were established. Roads were paved or cleared. Bridges were built over rivers. All this infrastructure creation makes the route faster and safer than alternatives, even though the original reasons for choosing it have long since become irrelevant. When you study a map of your world, you are looking at a palimpsest where the current geography has been written over older versions that still show through if you know how to look. That straight road that cuts through a forest, It was built by an empire that cleared the forest and planted fields there. And after the empire fell, the forest grew back around the road, but never fully reclaimed it. That mountain pass that seems unnecessarily elaborate, it was carved and shaped by earth magic when the mountains themselves were younger, created as a processional route for emperors who would never walk anywhere less grand. The island chain that forms a suspiciously regular arc. Those islands could be the tops of buildings from a sunken city, the only parts of its towers that still rise above the waves. You live in a world haunted by its own past. The ghosts of dead empires linger not as spirits, but as the lasting consequences of their actions. Every spell you cast uses magical theory developed by ancient wizards. Every political boundary reflects ancient wars and treaties. Every dungeon you explore was built for a purpose that made sense at the time, even if that purpose now seems alien or insane. You cannot escape this history because it forms the foundation of everything you know. When you seek powerful magic, when you pursue legendary artifacts, when you venture into ancient ruins, you are not simply going on an adventure. You are participating in an ongoing archaeological process, uncovering fragments of these lost civilizations and bringing their knowledge back into the light. Every ancient text you recover, every construct you study, every ruin you explore adds to your world's understanding of its own history. You are, whether you realize it or not, a scholar of lost things, a student of forgotten glory. The question you should ask yourself is not whether these empires deserved their fate. Moral judgments across such spans of time become meaningless. What matters is understanding what they achieved, why they fell, and what lessons their legacy holds for the present age. Your world contains younger kingdoms that seem to be following similar paths, making similar mistakes, exhibiting the same pride and overconfidence that doomed their predecessors. Will your civilization learn from history, or are you doomed to repeat it? Section 2. Nethril, the Arcanists who defied the gods. The wind whistles through canyons of sand where forests once grew, where rivers once flowed, where millions of people once lived their lives in the shadow of floating mountains. You stand in the Anauroch Desert, and the heat shimmers off dunes that stretch to every horizon. Beneath your feet, buried under countless tons of sand, lie the remnants of the greatest magical civilization your world has ever known. The empire of Nethril did not simply fall. It was obliterated so completely, so catastrophically, that the very land itself was transformed into a wasteland that has never recovered and perhaps never will. Nethril's story begins nearly 5,000 years before your current age, in a time when humanity was still finding its place in a world dominated by elves, dwarves, and dragons. The Protonetherese people were hunters and gatherers, nomadic tribes that followed game animals across the fertile plains of what would later become the desert. They possessed no magic beyond what hedge wizards and primitive shamans could muster. They built no cities, founded no kingdoms, created nothing that would suggest they were destined for greatness. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable in every way that mattered. Everything changed when a group of fishermen discovered something in their nets, something they had pulled up from the depths of a narrow sea. The object glowed with inner light, covered in script that hurt to look at directly, humming with power that made the air around it shimmer and dance. The fishermen brought their discovery to the tribal elders, who recognized it as something beyond their understanding, something that required careful study. They called it a scroll, though it was made of no material they had ever encountered, more like crystallized light than any form of parchment or vellum. This was the first of the Nether Scrolls, ancient artifacts that predated even the Elven kingdoms, created by a race called the Saruk, in an age so distant that the gods themselves were younger then. The Nether Scrolls contained magical knowledge of such depth and sophistication that merely reading them elevated the reader's understanding of arcane forces to heights previously unimaginable. The Protonetherese people, these simple fishermen and hunters, found themselves suddenly commanding magic that rivaled what elven archmages spent centuries learning. More scrolls were discovered over the following years. Each one revealed new aspects of magical theory, new applications of arcane power, new ways to reshape reality according to the caster's will. The Netherese people abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and founded their first city, Seventon, built around a central repository where the Nether Scrolls were kept and studied. Wizards came from across the region, drawn by rumors of this miraculous knowledge, and the city swelled with arcane researchers, all desperate for a chance to study the scrolls. You need to understand the magnitude of what the Nether Scrolls represented. These were not spellbooks as you would recognize them. They did not contain individual spells that could be memorized and cast. Instead, they provided fundamental understanding of how magic itself functioned, the deep principles that underlay all spellcasting. A wizard who mastered even a single page of a Nether Scroll could develop entirely new schools of magic, could create spells that no one had ever conceived before. The scrolls transformed magic from an art practiced by a gifted few into something approaching a science, with clear rules and reproducible results. Within a generation, the Netherese had established themselves as the dominant magical power in the region. Within 2 generations, they controlled territory that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Within 3 generations, they had developed magical techniques that elven archmages studied with mixture of awe and envy. The Netherese did not slowly build their empire through centuries of gradual progress. They exploded onto the world stage, going from primitive tribes to magical superpower in less time than it takes most kingdoms to establish stable succession laws. The Netherese developed a classification system for their wizards based on capability and achievement. They measured magical power by level, with each level representing a significant increase in the spells a wizard could master and cast. Most wizards in other lands never progressed beyond level 5 or 6, considered respectable practitioners who could make comfortable livings with their skills. The Netherese regularly produced wizards of level 10, level 15, level 20. These were not once-in-a-generation prodigies. These were expected achievement levels for graduates of their magical academies. As their magical prowess grew, so did their ambitions. The Netherese looked at the world around them and found it wanting. The land was too harsh, the climate too variable, the resources too scattered. Rather than adapting to their environment as other peoples did, the Netherese decided to adapt their environment to suit themselves. They developed spells of permanent enchantment that could reshape landscapes, redirect rivers, alter weather patterns. They created magical infrastructure on a scale that made elven achievements seem quaint by comparison. But the Netherese wizards wanted more than mere comfort and prosperity. They wanted to demonstrate their superiority in a manner that could never be questioned or forgotten. They wanted to build something so magnificent, so impossible, that all other peoples would have to acknowledge Netherese dominance. In the year -3859 Dale reckoning, approximately 3,400 years before your current age, the first floating enclave rose into the sky above the Netherese heartland. Imagine standing on solid ground and watching as a piece of the earth itself tears free from the landscape. Stone and soil, buildings and trees, all lifting into the air as if gravity had simply ceased to apply. The floating city rises slowly at first, then gains speed, climbing higher and higher until it hovers among the clouds themselves. Held aloft by magic so powerful, it seems to mock the natural order of things. This was not an illusion or a trick. This was a genuine reversal of fundamental natural laws, a demonstration that Netherese magic had progressed to the point where even the most basic rules of reality could be overwritten at will. The first enclave was called Zinlinal, and it became the model for dozens more that followed. Each enclave was a city unto itself, a self-contained community that floated thousands of feet above the surface world. The Netherese who lived in these sky cities considered themselves above ordinary mortals in every sense, both literally and metaphorically. They renamed themselves the Netherese High Mages, and they created a social hierarchy where those who lived in the enclaves were automatically considered superior to those who remained on the ground. Life in a floating enclave bore little resemblance to existence in any other city. The Netherese High Mages reshaped their environment according to their whims, creating artificial ecosystems that maintained themselves through permanent enchantments. Gardens grew in soil that never needed watering, nourished by magical forces rather than natural processes. The climate was always perfect, maintained at precisely comfortable temperatures, regardless of the season or altitude. Light was provided by ever-burning magical sources that never flickered or dimmed. Every convenience, every luxury that magic could provide was implemented as standard infrastructure. The enclaves themselves were architectural marvels that defied conventional engineering. Buildings rose to heights that would have been impossible on the ground, supported not by load-bearing walls, but by structural enchantments that distributed weight magically. Towers spiraled up from the enclave's surface, their upper reaches extending into cloud layers where only flying creatures could reach. Bridges of force connected different districts, transparent walkways that appeared to float unsupported in empty air. Gardens hung suspended between buildings, their soil held in place by enchantments rather than containers. Transportation within an enclave posed no challenge to residents. Permanent teleportation circles connected major districts, allowing instant travel from one end of the city to the other. For shorter distances, Netherese citizens used flight magic so casually that children learned levitation spells before they learned to read. The concept of stairs existed only in historical texts and ancient buildings. Why climb when you could simply fly? The Netherese adapted to three-dimensional existence, thinking in terms of up and down as readily as they thought in terms of north and south. The social structure of the enclaves reflected Netherese values regarding magical power. At the top of the hierarchy stood the Arcanists, the most powerful wizards who had achieved levels of magical mastery that made them effectively demigods. These individuals could cast spells of such magnitude that they could destroy armies, reshape landscapes, or breach the barriers between planes. Below them ranked the mages, skilled practitioners who might spend their entire lives studying magic and never approach the heights the Arcanists reached with apparent ease. Supporting this magical elite were the non-magical citizens, people who lived in the enclaves but possessed no spellcasting ability themselves. These individuals served as craftsmen, merchants, servants, and laborers, performing the mundane tasks that kept the enclaves functioning. The Netherese class system was rigid and hereditary. If you were born into a non-magical family, you remained non-magical regardless of your talents or achievements in other areas. The social mobility that existed in other societies had no place in Netherese culture. Your status was determined by your magical ability, full stop. But even the lowest-ranking citizen of a floating enclave lived in luxury that ground-dwelling Netherese could only dream of. The magic that sustained the enclaves provided abundant food, comfortable housing, and leisure time that other societies reserved for their nobility. A servant in an enclave ate better and lived more comfortably than a successful merchant in a ground-based city. This disparity created tension between the two groups, a simmering resentment that the arcanists either ignored or deliberately encouraged. The ground-based cities continued to exist and even thrive, though they were clearly second-tier settlements in the Netherese hierarchy. These cities served as resource centers for the enclaves, providing raw materials, food, and non-magical labor. The relationship was parasitic, with the enclaves taking what they needed and offering little in return beyond protection from external threats. Ground cities were ruled by lesser wizards or non-magical administrators who answered to arcanist overlords in the enclaves above them. Trade between enclaves and the ground developed its own unique character. Goods were transported via magical means rather than wagons or ships. Flying creatures carried cargo, or items were teleported directly from origin to destination. The Netherese developed standardized teleportation protocols that allowed safe transportation of both goods and passengers across vast distances instantly. What took other civilizations weeks or months to transport, the Netherese moved in seconds. The Netherese economy was based primarily on magical services rather than physical goods. The greatest wealth flowed to those who could create new spells, develop new magical items, or discover new applications of arcane forces. Netherese wizards sold their services throughout the known world, commanding prices that made them wealthier than most kings. A single Netherese arcanist could earn more from one contracted spell than an entire city might generate in tax revenue over a year. Magic items that other civilizations considered priceless relics were common trade goods in Netheril. The Netherese mass-produced enchanted items using assembly line processes that combined magical and mundane manufacturing techniques. Apprentice wizards would create base items in bulk. Then higher-level mages would add enchantments using standardized formulae. The result was a flood of magical goods that made Netheril wealthy beyond measure, and other nations dependent on Netherese exports. The Netherese relationship with religion was complicated and fraught with tension. The arcanists believed that their magic made them equal to the gods, that through sufficient study and power, they could achieve anything divine intervention might accomplish. They worshipped gods, but in a distant, transactional manner that lacked the reverence or devotion seen in other cultures. Prayers were more like negotiations than supplications. Offerings were made with the expectation of specific returns. Divine magic existed, but it was seen as inferior to arcane power, a crutch for those who lacked the intelligence or discipline to master true spellcasting. This attitude toward the divine would prove to be one of Netheril's fatal flaws. The arcanists grew so confident in their own power that they stopped fearing the gods. They began researching ways to claim divine power for themselves, to ascend to godhood through magical means rather than divine appointment. Multiple arcanists pursued this goal simultaneously, each convinced that they would be the first to achieve apotheosis. This hubris, this absolute certainty that nothing lay beyond their reach, set Nethril on a path toward catastrophe. The pinnacle of Netheri's achievement came with the development of Mythalar, massive magical devices that served as the power sources for the floating enclaves. Each Mythalar was a sphere of pure magical energy, contained and controlled by enchantments of breathtaking complexity. The Mythalar drew power from the weave itself, the fundamental magical field that permeated all reality, and converted that raw energy into usable forms that sustained the enclave's infrastructure. Without their Mythalar, the enclaves would fall from the sky. Creating a Mythalar required magical knowledge and skill that only the greatest arcanists possessed. The process took years of preparation and required the participation of dozens of powerful mages working in perfect coordination. One mistake, one miscalculation, could result in a magical explosion that would vaporize everyone involved. Yet, the Netheries created dozens of Mythalars successfully, demonstrating a level of magical sophistication that no later civilization has ever matched. The Mythalars did more than simply keep the enclaves airborne. They served as focal points for all the enclave's magical infrastructure, powering everything from the ever-burning lights to the climate control systems to the defensive wards that protected against external threats. The Mythalars made magic so abundant and readily available that casting spells became easier in the enclaves than anywhere else in the world. The weave was thicker there, more responsive, more pliable. At its height, Nethril encompassed dozens of floating enclaves and numerous ground cities, controlling territory that stretched across much of northern Faerûn. The Empire's population numbered in the millions, with a small fraction living in the floating enclaves and the vast majority dwelling on the ground. The wealth flowing through Netheri's cities dwarfed that of any other nation. The magic available to even relatively minor Netheries, wizards, exceeded what elven archmages commanded. Nethril seemed invincible, eternal, beyond the reach of any force that might threaten it. Then came Karsus, the man who would destroy everything his people had built. Karsus was a prodigy, even by Netheri standards. He cast his first spell at age 2. By age 10, he was creating new spells that other wizards spent decades trying to understand. By age 20, he had achieved level 41, a height of magical power that made him the most powerful mortal spellcaster in recorded history. Karsus commanded magic on a scale that made other arcanists seem like apprentices by comparison. He could reshape landscapes with a gesture, summon storms that raged for weeks, create magical effects that persisted for centuries. But Karsus wanted more. He looked at the world and saw problems that even Netheri's magic could not solve. A race of creatures called the Faerûn had been attacking Netheri's settlements for years. Creatures immune to most magic and possessed of life-draining abilities that made them nearly impossible to defeat. The Faerûn threatened to destroy Netheral's ground cities. And while the floating enclaves remained safe for the moment, Karsus knew that eventually the Faerûn would find a way to attack them as well. Karsus believed he had found the solution. He would cast a spell of unprecedented magnitude, a spell that would grant him control over the weave itself. He would become the god of magic, if only temporarily, and in that moment of divine power, he would destroy the Faerûn forever. The spell would last only minutes, but minutes would be enough. He called his creation Karsus's avatar, and it was classified as a 12th level spell, a category that had never existed before and would never exist again. On the 30th day of Ches in the year -339 Dale Reckoning, Karsus cast his spell. He reached out with his magic and grasped the weave itself, attempting to steal the divine power of Mistral, goddess of magic. For a brief moment, he succeeded. Karsus became a god, channeling power that no mortal was meant to touch. He felt the connection to every spell being cast across the entire world, felt the weight of maintaining the weave's integrity, felt the impossible complexity of managing magical forces across all of reality. And then he realized his mistake. The power was too much. His mortal mind, even expanded and enhanced by his unprecedented magical ability, could not process the information flooding into it. He could not maintain the weave's stability because he did not understand what needed to be maintained. For just a moment, less than a minute, the weave faltered as Karsus struggled to control forces beyond his comprehension. In that moment, every spell being cast across the entire world failed. Every magical effect that depended on the weave's stability collapsed. Every mythalar in every floating enclave shut down simultaneously. The enclaves fell from the sky. Imagine standing on the ground and watching as the floating cities plummet toward you. Stone and soil, buildings and people, all falling faster and faster as gravity reasserts its dominance. The sound must have been apocalyptic. A thunderous roar as dozens of cities, the size of mountains, crashed into the earth. The impact sent shockwaves that could be felt hundreds of miles away. Dust and debris filled the air, blocking out the sun for days. Most of the enclaves were destroyed completely in the fall, shattered into fragments by the impact. Millions died instantly, crushed by falling buildings, or simply killed by the suddenness of the descent. A few enclaves survived partially intact, protected by emergency wards that activated when the mythalars failed. But even these were devastated. Whole districts were torn apart. Buildings collapsed. Fire swept through neighborhoods where no fire should have been able to burn in the magically controlled environment. The goddess Mistral died in that moment as well, sacrificing herself to prevent even worse catastrophe. As Karsus stole her power, as the weave began to unravel, Mistral made a choice. She dissolved herself, temporarily disrupting the weave completely, killing Karsus, and ending his spell before it could tear reality apart entirely. She was immediately reborn as the goddess Mistra, but the brief interruption was enough. The weave stabilized, though deeply scarred by what Karsus had done. The fallout from Karsus's folly, as it came to be known, extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The magical cataclysm transformed the climate of the entire region. Fertile lands became desert almost overnight, as the combination of falling enclaves and wild magic scoured the landscape. Rivers dried up or changed course. Forests withered and died. The Anauroch Desert was born, created by the death throes of the Netherese Empire. The few surviving Netherese scattered in every direction, refugees from a catastrophe that had destroyed their entire civilization in minutes. Some fled to other lands, bringing their knowledge with them and founding new nations. Others went into hiding, using magic to preserve themselves and their culture, until such time as they might rise again. A few managed to reach other planes of existence, most notably the plane of shadow, where they would endure for nearly 2,000 years before returning to the world as the Shadowvar. The impact of Netheral's fall on human magical development cannot be overstated. The knowledge contained in Netheral's libraries was scattered and largely lost. Spells that had been common in Netheral became legendary secrets that later wizards spent lifetimes trying to rediscover. The techniques for creating mythalars vanished entirely, lost when the last arcanist who understood them died in the fall. Magic itself was fundamentally changed by what Karsus had done. Mistra established new limitations on spellcasting, decreeing that mortal wizards would never again be able to cast spells above level 9. The age of Netherese supremacy was over, and it would never come again. The ruins of fallen enclaves still exist in the Anauroch Desert, buried under sand or jutting up from the dunes like broken bones. These sites are extremely dangerous to explore. The magic that once sustained the enclaves did not dissipate cleanly. It lingers in twisted forms, creating reality distortions that make navigation nearly impossible, and temporal anomalies where time flows at different rates. Creatures mutated by centuries of exposure to wild magic haunt these ruins. Things that should not exist, but do, because the very laws of nature are compromised in their vicinity. Yet despite the dangers, adventurers still seek out these ruins, drawn by the promise of Netherese artifacts and lost knowledge. A single intact Netherese spellbook could make a wizard wealthy and famous. A functioning Netherese magic item possesses power that modern enchantment cannot match. The ruins represent the pinnacle of human magical achievement, and there are those who believe that studying what remains might allow them to reclaim some of what was lost. The lesson of Netheral echoes through the ages as a warning about the dangers of hubris and unchecked ambition. Here was a civilization that achieved heights of magical power that seemed to place them beyond any threat, that made them rivals to the gods themselves. Yet they were destroyed not by external conquest, but by their own overconfidence, brought low because one wizard believed there was no limit to what he could achieve. The Netherese thought they had mastered magic completely, that they understood the fundamental forces of reality. They were wrong, and their error cost them everything. Section 3. The Southern Empires Imaskar, Mulhorand, and Undr. While Netheril dominated the northern lands with their floating cities and reality-bending magic, other empires rose in the south, older than the Netherese civilization by thousands of years. These southern powers built their glory not on arcane mastery alone, but on a combination of artifice, divine manipulation, and sheer determination to impose order on a hostile world. The empires of Imaskar, Mulhorand, and Undr shaped the eastern lands of Faerûn in ways that persist even now. Their legacies written not just in ruins, but in the blood and souls of entire peoples. You must travel far to the east to find where these empires once stood, beyond the inner sea to lands that most Western adventurers never visit. The geography itself tells stories of ancient glory, vast tracts of desert broken by fertile river valleys, mountain ranges that seem placed deliberately to form natural barriers, oases that appear with suspicious regularity, their waters never failing even in the driest years. This is landscape that has been shaped by conscious intent, by civilizations that possessed both the power and the patience to remake the world according to their design. The Imaskari Empire emerged first, rising to power approximately 11,000 years before your current age, in an era so distant that even elven records from that time are fragmentary at best. The Imaskari were humans who developed a culture focused on artifice and engineering rather than pure spellcasting. While they possessed powerful wizards, the Imaskari excelled at creating permanent magical constructs, devices, and infrastructure that functioned independently of active spellcasting. They built their power on systems rather than individual genius, on reproducible processes rather than unique insights. The Imaskari heartland lay in what is now the plains of purple dust, though when they ruled it was no dusty plain, but fertile territory crisscrossed by irrigation canals and dotted with prosperous cities. The Imaskari transformed marginal land into agricultural abundance through massive engineering projects that redirected water, enriched soil, and controlled weather patterns across entire regions. They did not merely adapt to their environment. They rewrote it according to their specifications. What set the Imaskari apart from other magical civilizations was their mastery of portal magic. The Imaskari developed techniques for creating stable, permanent portals that connected distant locations, allowing instantaneous travel across impossible distances. These were not temporary gates that collapsed after a single use, not unpredictable rifts that might deposit travelers anywhere. These were reliable, controllable doorways that functioned with mechanical precision. An Imiskari citizen could step through a portal in one city and emerge in another city thousands of miles away, making the journey in a single step. The implications of this technology were staggering. The Imiskari could project military force anywhere in their empire instantly. They could trade goods across vast distances without caravans or ships. They could evacuate civilians from threatened areas or reinforce positions under attack faster than any enemy could respond. Portal networks gave the Imiskari an insurmountable strategic advantage over neighboring peoples who still relied on conventional transportation. Distance ceased to be a meaningful obstacle to Imiskari power. But the Imiskari grew arrogant in their mastery. Their empire expanded rapidly as they conquered neighboring territories, and they needed laborers to work their vast construction projects and agricultural enterprises. The Imiskari looked beyond their own world for a workforce, using their portal magic to reach other planes and realities. They opened gates to distant worlds and took what they wanted, kidnapping entire populations and bringing them back to serve as slaves. Among the peoples the Imiskari enslaved were the ancestors of the Mulan, humans from another world who worshipped powerful deities. The Imiskari forced these people through portals and set them to work building monuments and working fields. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people were taken in this manner, torn from their homelands and transported to an alien world where they had no power, no rights, no hope of return. The enslaved Mulan prayed to their gods for deliverance. They cried out for divine intervention, for their deities to rescue them from bondage. Their prayers went unanswered, not because their gods were weak or uncaring, but because the Imiskari had taken precautions. The artificers of Imiskar had created a barrier, a ward of staggering power that encircled their entire empire and blocked the gods from entering. Divine beings could not pierce this defense. The prayers of the enslaved reached their gods, but the gods could not reach back. This represented hubris on a scale that dwarfed even the arrogance of the Netherese arcanists. The Imiskari had looked at the gods themselves and decided they could be kept at bay through superior engineering. They believed their artifice could match divine power, that their wards would hold forever, that they were safe from any retaliation. They were wrong, and their error would doom them just as thoroughly as Karsus's folly doomed Netheril. The gods of the enslaved Mulan could not enter the Imiskari Empire directly, but they found another path. If they could not come to their worshippers, they would send their worshippers to them. The deities reached through the same portals the Imiskari had used to kidnap the Mulan in the first place, pulling their followers back to their original world. In the year -2488 Dale Reckoning, the enslaved Mulan simply vanished from Imiskar. Every single one disappeared overnight, spirited away by divine intervention that bypassed the Imaskari wards completely. The loss of their entire slave workforce was catastrophic for the Imaskari economy, but worse was yet to come. The gods did not stop with rescuing their worshippers. They were angry. Their people had been enslaved for generations, had suffered and died in bondage, while their gods were kept away by mortal magic. That rage demanded vengeance, and the gods prepared to deliver it in full measure. The deities could not enter Imaskar themselves, but they could empower their followers to act as divine instruments. The gods elevated certain Mulan to positions of immense power, transforming them into god kings who channeled divine might while still remaining technically mortal. These god kings, manifestations of deities like Ra, Horus Re, Isis, Osiris, and others from the Mulhorandi pantheon, led their people back through the portals to the world that had enslaved them. They came as conquerors, backed by divine power that overwhelmed Imaskari defenses. The war between the returning Mulan and the Imaskari Empire was brief and utterly one-sided. The Imaskari artificers discovered that their constructs and devices could not stand against enemies who wielded literal divine power. Their battle magic failed against opponents protected by the gods themselves. Their portal networks were turned against them as the god kings learned to control the gates and used them to strike deep into Imaskari territory. Within a single year, the Imaskari Empire collapsed completely. The destruction visited upon Imaskar was thorough and deliberate. The god kings did not simply conquer the empire, they erased it. Cities were leveled to their foundations. Libraries were burned. Monuments were toppled and ground to dust. The Imaskari population was scattered, killed, or driven into hiding in distant lands. The plains that had been made fertile through Imaskari engineering were deliberately despoiled, transformed into the wasteland now known as the Plains of Purple Dust. The god kings wanted to ensure that Imaskar would never rise again, and they succeeded completely. On the ruins of the Imaskari Empire, the victorious Mulan founded two new kingdoms. The larger was Mulhorand, ruled by the god King Horus Re and his divine family. The smaller was Undr, governed by the god King Enlil and his pantheon. These new nations were theocracies of the most literal kind, kingdoms where the gods themselves walked the earth and ruled directly over their mortal subjects. The god kings were not distant beings who communicated through priests and portents. They were physical presences, immortal rulers who sat on actual thrones and made decisions that their citizens could observe directly. Mulhorand became the more successful of the two nations, perhaps because its divine rulers took a more active interest in governance and the welfare of their people. The god kings of Mulhorand established a sophisticated administrative system that combined divine authority with practical bureaucracy. The pharaoh, always a manifestation of Horus Re, ruled absolutely, but relied on a hierarchy of nobles, priests, and officials to manage day-to-day affairs. This system proved remarkably stable, enduring for thousands of years, with relatively little internal conflict. The key to Mulhoran's stability lay in how the divine rulers handled succession and mortality. The god kings were technically mortal, meaning they could be killed. But when one died, another would be chosen to serve as the new manifestation. The gods themselves selected these vessels, choosing individuals who would channel their power and authority. This process ensured that the divine rulers always possessed both legitimacy and capability. A weak or corrupt manifestation would simply be replaced, preventing the kind of dynastic decay that plagued purely mortal kingdoms. Mulhorandi society was rigidly hierarchical, divided into castes that determined every aspect of a person's life from birth to death. At the top stood the divine rulers and their immediate servants. Below them ranked the nobility, families that had served the gods faithfully and been rewarded with hereditary titles and lands. The priesthood occupied a position parallel to the nobility, wielding enormous influence through their role as intermediaries between the gods and common people. Skilled artisans, merchants, and scribes formed a middle class. Farmers and laborers occupied the bottom of the free population. Below them, all were slaves, though slavery in Mulhorand was less harsh than in many other cultures. You need to understand that slavery in Mulhorand was fundamentally different from the slavery practiced by the Imiskari. The Mulhorandi remembered what it meant to be enslaved, and while they saw nothing wrong with the institution itself, they imposed strict limits on how slaves could be treated. Slaves had legal rights. They could own property. They could earn their freedom through faithful service. Many slaves in Mulhorand lived better than free peasants in other nations, a fact that sometimes led to the paradoxical situation of poor freemen selling themselves into slavery to improve their circumstances. The economy of Mulhorand was based primarily on agriculture and mining. The nation controlled fertile river valleys where grain grew in abundance, producing enough surplus to export food to neighboring regions. Mulhorandi mining operations extracted gold, copper, and gemstones from deposits that seemed inexhaustible wealth that flowed into the pharaoh's treasury and funded magnificent construction projects. Temples rose in every city, monuments to the gods who ruled in person. Pyramids served as tombs for dead god kings, structures built to endure until the end of time itself. Magic in Mulhorand took on a distinctly religious character. While arcane spellcasting existed, it was viewed with suspicion as a practice associated with the hated Imiskari. Divine magic was considered superior, purer, more legitimate because it flowed directly from the gods. Priests wielded enormous power in Mulhorandi society, serving not only as religious leaders, but as healers, advisors, and often as provincial governors. The priesthood was a path to influence and wealth for those born into the right families. and competition for positions in major temples could be fierce. Undr, the smaller kingdom founded alongside Mulhorand, took a different path. Where Mulhorand developed a stable system that balanced divine rule with practical governance, Undr struggled with internal conflicts and succession crises. The god kings of Undr were less benevolent than their Mulhorandi counterparts, ruling through fear and force rather than through perceived divine benevolence. This approach created a culture of resentment and rebellion that weakened the kingdom from within. The turning point for Undr came during a war with a race of dragon-like beings. The god king Gilgim led Undr's forces personally, and while he achieved victory, the war left him changed. He became paranoid, cruel, convinced that everyone around him plotted his downfall. He began executing nobles and priests on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The other god kings of Undr gradually withdrew from active rulership or were eliminated by Gilgim, leaving him as the sole divine presence in the kingdom. Under Gilgim's increasingly tyrannical rule, Undr declined slowly but inexorably. The kingdom lost territory to neighboring powers. Its economy stagnated as trade partners sought markets elsewhere. Its population decreased as people fled to other lands. Yet Gilgim endured, immortal and apparently unkillable, grinding his nation into dust through sheer stubbornness. He ruled Undr for 3,000 years, long after any mortal king would have died, watching as the kingdom that once rivaled Mulhorand shrank to a shadow of its former glory. The relationship between Mulhorand and Undr was complex and often hostile. The two nations shared common origins, worshipped related pantheons, and spoke similar languages, yet they competed for dominance in the region, fighting periodic wars that drained resources and killed thousands. Neither could achieve decisive victory over the other. Mulhorand was larger and richer, but Undr's military tradition and Gilgim's personal power kept it competitive. The rivalry became part of both nations' identities, a perpetual conflict that neither side could afford to lose or seemed able to win. Both kingdoms also had to contend with external threats. To the west lay the Empire of Thay, a nation of red-robed wizards who coveted Mulhorandi territory and magical knowledge. To the north were various city-states and smaller kingdoms that chafed under the dominance of their southern neighbors. Pirates raided coastal settlements, taking slaves and cargo with impunity. Nomadic tribes from the desert periodically launched raids seeking plunder. The god kings of Mulhorand and Undr spent as much effort defending their borders as they did competing with each other. The ruins of Imaskar, lying within territories claimed by both Mulhorand and Undr, remained largely unexplored for thousands of years. The god kings had deliberately destroyed as much as possible, but their destruction was not total. Buried beneath the purple dust were Imaskari facilities that had survived the conquest intact sealed chambers, and underground complexes that the conquerors never found. These sites contained Imiskari artifacts and knowledge, particularly information about portal magic and artifice that later ages would find valuable. Both Mulhorand and Unther officially forbade exploration of Imiskari ruins. The God Kings wanted no one recovering Imiskari knowledge, fearing that it might lead to a resurgence of the empire they had worked so hard to destroy. This prohibition only made the ruins more attractive to adventurers and treasure seekers. Tales spread of vast wealth hidden beneath the purple dust, of portal networks that still functioned, of constructs that waited in darkness for commands that would never come. Many expeditions ventured into the ruins seeking fortune. Few returned, and those who did often came back changed in disturbing ways. The fall of Unther finally came in the year 1358 Dale Reckoning, during an event called the Time of Troubles, when all the gods were forced to walk the world in mortal form. Gilgim, stripped of much of his divine power, was killed in single combat by a half-demon warrior. His death created a power vacuum that plunged Unther into chaos. Without their God King, the people of Unther did not know how to govern themselves. Rival factions claimed authority. The kingdom fragmented into squabbling city-states. Much of Unther's territory was conquered by Mulhorand or absorbed by other neighbors. Mulhorand survived the Time of Troubles relatively intact, though not unchanged. The crisis demonstrated that even God Kings could die, that divine power had limits. This revelation sparked philosophical and religious debates that continue to ripple through Mulhorandi society. Some argued that the gods had betrayed their people by showing weakness. Others claimed that the temporary mortality of the gods proved their willingness to share in mortal suffering. The priesthood split into factions, supporting different interpretations, creating political instability that the pharaoh struggled to control. In more recent years, both Mulhorand and what remains of Unther faced an existential threat from Thay. The nation of red-robed wizards launched invasions aimed at conquering both kingdoms. The wars raged for years, with cities changing hands multiple times and vast armies clashing in battles that killed hundreds of thousands. Mulhorand fought desperately, calling on every resource at its disposal, awakening ancient defenses and making pacts with powers it had previously shunned. Based on what we know of Mulhorand's history, we can assume that the God King's eventual return provided the leadership and divine power needed to turn the tide. Their reappearance after a period of absence could imply that they had been attending to matters on other planes, or had withdrawn temporarily to test their people's resolve. This pattern of divine withdrawal and return appears to be a recurring theme in Mulhorandi history, suggesting a relationship between mortals and gods that is more complex than simple worship and rule. The legacy of these southern empires extends far beyond their current borders. The Mulan people spread throughout Faerûn, establishing communities in distant lands and bringing their culture with them. Mulhorandi architectural styles influenced building practices across the eastern realms. The bureaucratic systems developed in ancient Mulhorand served as models for later kingdoms seeking to create stable administrative structures. Even the religious practices of Mulhorand, the direct worship of gods who manifested physically, affected how other cultures understood the relationship between mortals and deities. The lesson of Amaskar echoes through the ages as a warning about the dangers of enslaving others and believing yourself beyond divine retribution. The Amaskari achieved incredible technological and magical heights, creating wonders that later ages could not match. Yet they were destroyed not by superior force or better magic, but by the justifiable anger of gods whose people they had enslaved. No ward, no matter how powerful, could protect them from the consequences of their crimes. The gods found a way, as gods always do, and Amaskar paid the price. Mulhorand demonstrates both the benefits and costs of theocracy. The nation achieved remarkable stability through direct divine rule, avoiding the succession crises and civil wars that plague mortal kingdoms. Yet that stability came at the cost of stagnation. Mulhorand changed very little over thousands of years, maintaining the same social structures and cultural practices across millennia. Innovation was discouraged, tradition was everything, and anyone who suggested radical changes was viewed with suspicion. The kingdom endured, but it did not grow or adapt as readily as more dynamic societies. And there serves as a cautionary tale about the corruption of immortal rulers. Giljeem had all the time in the world to become a better king, to learn from his mistakes and grow into a wise and benevolent leader. Instead, he became worse with each passing century, his flaws magnified by time rather than smoothed away. Without death to provide natural limits on his rule, without the possibility of succession forcing renewal, Giljeem dragged Unther down with him into tyranny and decay. These southern empires shaped the eastern lands of Faerûn in ways that persist to your current day. The geographic changes wrought by Amaskari engineering remain visible. The religious traditions established by Mulhorand's god kings continue to influence millions of believers. The ruins scattered across the region draw adventurers seeking ancient treasures and lost knowledge. You cannot understand the modern nations of the East without understanding the empires that preceded them, the powers that rose and fell and left their marks on both the land and the people. Section 4. Myth Draenor and the Dreams of Elven Unity. The forests of Cormenther stretch for hundreds of miles, ancient woodlands where trees have grown for thousands of years, undisturbed by axe or fire. You walk beneath canopies so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor. your footsteps muffled by layers of fallen leaves accumulated over centuries. The air smells of rich earth and growing things, of life that has flourished here since before your ancestors learned to work stone. Yet, for all its beauty, for all its seeming timelessness, this forest holds memories of something greater, echoes of a civilization that attempted what no other had dared. Deep within Cormenther lie the ruins of Myth Drannor, the city of song, the greatest achievement of elven civilization, and perhaps its greatest tragedy. You approach through undergrowth that has reclaimed ancient streets, past buildings whose walls still stand despite centuries of neglect. The architecture speaks of grace and beauty even in its decay. Structures that were designed not merely to shelter, but to inspire, to elevate the spirit of anyone who looked upon them. This was a city built by artists and dreamers, by those who believed that beauty and harmony could triumph over the darkness that always threatens to consume the world. Myth Drannor was founded in the year 261 Dale Reckoning, though the elven settlement that preceded it had existed for thousands of years before. The elves of Cormenther had long dwelt in the forest, building communities that blended seamlessly with the natural world, creating homes that enhanced rather than replaced the wilderness around them. They lived in relative isolation from other races, maintaining their ancient traditions and avoiding the conflicts that consumed younger peoples. The elves believed themselves superior to other races, not through arrogance, but through simple observation. They had existed for millennia, while human kingdoms rose and fell like summer flowers. But some elves began to question this isolation. They looked at the younger races and saw potential rather than primitiveness. They observed how humans adapted and innovated, how dwarves built with unmatched skill, how halflings created communities of genuine warmth and fellowship. These forward-thinking elves wondered what might be achieved if the wisdom of elves combined with the energy of younger races. If different peoples worked together toward common goals, rather than competing for dominance or remaining separate. The driving force behind this vision was Coronel Eltargrim, ruler of the Elven realm. Eltargrim believed that the elves had grown stagnant in their isolation, that their culture had ossified into unchanging patterns that prevented growth and adaptation. He proposed something radical, something that horrified many of his people. He wanted to open the Elven realm to other races, to invite humans, dwarves, halflings, and gnomes to live among the elves as equals rather than as guests or servants. He dreamed of a city where all races could dwell together in harmony, where the strengths of each people would complement the strengths of others. This proposal sparked fierce debate among the elves of Cormenther. Many viewed it as heresy, a betrayal of elven traditions that had endured for tens of thousands of years. They argued that allowing other races into elven lands would corrupt elven culture, that the younger races would bring their conflicts and their short-sighted values with them. Some claimed that the very presence of non-elves in the forest would damage the land itself, that the magic sustaining the woodland required elven stewardship and would fail if contaminated by others. Yet Eltargrim persisted, and gradually he won converts to his cause. He pointed out that elven civilization, for all its longevity, had produced little that was truly new in the past 1,000 years. Elven artists created works that were technically perfect, but spiritually empty, copying the styles of their predecessors without innovation. Elven magic had plateaued, with contemporary wizards learning spells developed millennia ago, but creating few new ones. The elves were not growing. They were merely enduring, and endurance without growth was indistinguishable from slow death. In the year 261 Dale Reckoning, Eltargrim formally declared that the forests of Cormenther would be open to all peaceful races. He renamed the capital city Myth-Drannor, which translates to something close to Fortress of Song and Beauty in the Elven tongue, emphasizing that this was meant to be a sanctuary for all peoples rather than an exclusively Elven realm. He sent emissaries to human settlements, dwarven holds, and halfling villages, inviting representatives to come and help build this new society. The response exceeded Eltargrim's most optimistic expectations. Humans came seeking the wisdom and magical knowledge of elves. Dwarves came to learn elven craft techniques and share their own mastery of metalwork. Halflings came seeking the beauty and tranquility that elven communities offered. Gnomes arrived eager to exchange knowledge with elven artificers and naturalists. Within a generation, Myth-Drannor had transformed from an elven city into something unprecedented, a true cosmopolitan community where multiple races lived and worked together as genuine equals. The key to making this arrangement function was the Mythal, a permanent magical field that encompassed the entire city and its surrounding territory. Mythals were an ancient form of elven high magic, created through rituals so complex that they required the cooperation of dozens of powerful mages working in perfect harmony over extended periods. A mythal could selectively alter the laws of nature within its boundaries, establishing new rules that superseded normal reality. The mythal of Myth-Drannor was designed specifically to promote harmony and prevent conflict between the city's diverse inhabitants. The effects of the mythal were subtle but pervasive. Violence within the city became more difficult as the mythal itself resisted aggressive actions and dulled hostile impulses. Diseases that might have spread rapidly in such a densely populated urban environment were suppressed or eliminated entirely. The climate within the mythal's boundaries remained perpetually mild, never too hot or too cold. Crops grew more abundantly, water stayed pure, and the very air seemed cleaner and more refreshing than in surrounding territories. But the mythal did more than provide physical benefits. It enhanced communication between peoples who spoke different languages, making it easier for residents to understand one another even across linguistic barriers. It promoted empathy, helping people of different backgrounds to appreciate perspectives that would otherwise seem alien. The mythal created an environment where cooperation came more naturally than conflict, where the residents' better natures were consistently reinforced, while their baser impulses were gently discouraged. Life in Myth Drannor during its golden age must have been extraordinary. You would have walked streets where elven artisans worked alongside human craftsmen, where dwarven smiths collaborated with gnome artificers, where halfling merchants traded with customers of all races. The city became a center of learning that attracted scholars from across Faerûn and beyond. Libraries held texts in dozens of languages. Academies taught both arcane and divine magic to students regardless of their race or background. The arts flourished as different cultural traditions merged and influenced one another, creating new forms of expression. The architectural style of Myth Drannor reflected this cultural synthesis. Buildings combined elven grace with human practicality and dwarven durability. Towers rose to heights that displayed elven love of verticality, but used construction techniques borrowed from dwarven engineering. Gardens were laid out in geometric patterns that pleased human aesthetics, while incorporating the naturalistic elements that elves preferred. The city was beautiful, but it was a beauty that belonged to no single race. It was something new, something that could only have emerged from genuine collaboration. Magic in Myth Drannor reached heights that exceeded even the achievements of Netheril in some respects. The Netherese had focused on individual power, on creating wizards of unprecedented personal capability. Myth Drannor's approach was different. The city's mages worked collaboratively, combining their strengths and compensating for one another's weaknesses. Rituals that would have been impossible for any single caster became achievable when multiple mages pooled their abilities. The result was magic of extraordinary sophistication and subtlety. Enchantments that modified reality in precise and carefully controlled ways. The city's defenders were renowned throughout the realms. The Faer, which translates to Army of the Art, or sometimes called the Army of Darkness, in reference to their role as protectors against evil, consisted of warriors and spellcasters from all races who trained together and fought as a unified force. They were not simply a collection of soldiers from different backgrounds. They were a genuinely integrated military force where racial differences were viewed as tactical advantages rather than sources of division. Elven archers worked with human heavy infantry. Dwarven defenders held key positions, while gnome engineers provided support with magical devices. The Faer became the gold standard by which other armies measured themselves. Trade flowed through Myth Drannor from every direction. Merchants knew they would find fair treatment in the city regardless of their origin. The courts enforced contracts impartially, protecting traders from fraud or coercion. The city's markets offered goods from across the known world exotic items that could be found nowhere else, because myth Draenor's cosmopolitan nature made it the natural hub for international commerce. Wealth accumulated in the city, but it was wealth that flowed back out through trade and cultural exchange rather than hoarding. For over 700 years, myth Draenor stood as proof that different races could coexist peacefully and productively. The city produced innovations in magic, art, governance, and philosophy that influenced civilizations across Faerûn. Scholars traveled from distant lands to study in myth Draenor's libraries. Artists came seeking inspiration from the city's galleries and performances. Young wizards dreamed of studying at the city's academies, where they might learn from the greatest magical minds of any race. But darkness gathered beyond the mythal's protective boundaries. Evil forces looked upon myth Draenor with hatred and envy. Devils resented the city's goodness and harmony, viewing it as an affront to their infernal nature. Demons were drawn to the city precisely because it represented everything they opposed. Dark wizards coveted the magical knowledge accumulated in myth Draenor's libraries, and the Drow, the dark elves who dwelt deep underground, saw the surface elves' experiment in racial harmony as heresy that needed to be destroyed. These disparate forces had always been present, but they had never been organized. They attacked individually or in small groups, probing the city's defenses, but never mounting serious threats. The Akfair repelled these raids easily, and the Mythal prevented attackers from penetrating deeply into the city, even when they breached the outer walls. Myth Draenor seemed invulnerable, protected by both magical and military might that no enemy could overcome. What the defenders of myth Draenor failed to anticipate was that their enemies might unite against them. In the year 714 Dale Reckoning, a coalition began to form among the dark powers surrounding the city. Devils and demons, traditional enemies, agreed to set aside their mutual hatred to focus on their shared target. Dark wizards contributed their knowledge and power to the cause. The Drow provided intelligence about the city's layout and defenses, information gathered from spies who had infiltrated myth Draenor over decades. Orcish and goblinoid tribes were recruited as shock troops, promised loot and glory if they would serve. This coalition, sometimes called the Army of Darkness in a dark irony, given the name of myth Draenor's defenders, gathered in the forests beyond the city's borders. The size of the assembled force was staggering. Tens of thousands of warriors, supported by hundreds of powerful spellcasters, and accompanied by demons and devils from the lower planes themselves, prepared for assault. The coalition spent months coordinating their forces with a level of organization that surprised those who had assumed evil could never cooperate effectively toward common goals. The assault began in the spring of 714 Dale Reckoning. The Army of Darkness attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the outer defenses through sheer numbers. The Faerûn fought desperately, but they were outnumbered by margins that made victory nearly impossible. Districts fell one by one as the defenders were pushed back toward the city center. The Mythal itself came under attack by enemy mages who had spent years studying its structure and preparing counterspells designed specifically to disrupt its functioning. The siege lasted months, with fighting raging through streets and buildings that had known only peace for centuries. Civilians fled or died as the city that had been their sanctuary became a war zone. The defenders performed miracles of courage and skill, holding positions that should have fallen, launching counterattacks that temporarily drove back the invaders. But the army of darkness had numbers and determination that the Faerûn could not match. Slowly, inevitably, the city fell. The final blow came when enemy mages succeeded in partially disrupting the Mythal. The magical field did not collapse entirely, but its protections weakened at critical points, allowing demons and devils to penetrate areas they had previously been unable to enter. These extraplanar beings spread through the city like wildfire, killing indiscriminately and desecrating anything beautiful they encountered. The last organized resistance collapsed as the defenders were overwhelmed from multiple directions at once. By the end of that terrible year, Myth Drannor lay in ruins. Most of its population was dead or scattered as refugees. The great libraries had been burned. The academies were destroyed. The beautiful buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The Mythal still functioned, but it had been corrupted by the evil that now permeated the city, twisted into something that attracted and empowered dark forces rather than repelling them. Myth Drannor, the shining city, was gone, replaced by a haunted ruin that no sane person would willingly enter. The fall of Myth Drannor sent shockwaves throughout elven civilization. Many elves interpreted it as proof that their traditionalist kin had been right all along, that attempting to forge alliances with shorter-lived races was folly that could only end in disaster. The elves began withdrawing from human lands, retreating to isolated forests and islands where they could maintain their ancient ways without contamination from outside influences. The great experiment in racial cooperation was declared a failure, and the elves returned to the isolation they had maintained for thousands of years before Eltargrim's reforms. But Myth Drannor was not the first or only elven kingdom to fall. The history of elven civilization is littered with fallen realms, each representing different approaches to the challenges facing their people. Cormenther, the forest kingdom that became Myth Drannor, was merely the most recent and most dramatic failure in a long pattern of elven decline. Thousands of years earlier, the elven empire of Aravendar had dominated much of northern Faerûn. Aravendar was militaristic and expansionist, believing that elven superiority gave them the right to rule over all lesser races. the Aravandari conquered neighboring elven kingdoms and imposed their rule by force, creating an empire held together by military might rather than shared values. This approach led to the Crown Wars, a series of conflicts that raged among the elven kingdoms for thousands of years. The wars devastated elven civilization, killing millions and destroying countless ancient settlements. Aravandar itself was eventually destroyed, conquered by allied elven realms who rejected its aggressive philosophy. The island kingdom of Evermeet represented a different approach. Faced with the decline of elven power on the mainland, many elves retreated to this mystical island that existed partially in another plane of reality. Evermeet became a refuge for elven culture, a place where ancient traditions could be preserved without interference from the younger races. But this preservation came at a cost. Evermeet became increasingly isolated and insular, concerned only with maintaining what had been rather than creating anything new. The elves of Evermeet endured, but whether they truly thrived remains a matter of interpretation. Other elven realms fell to more mundane causes. The kingdom of Irlan was overrun by orcs from the north, its population scattered, and its lands reduced to wilderness. The settlements of Mirritter were destroyed by magic unleashed during the Crown Wars, transformed into a cursed moorland that remained dangerous for millennia. The coastal realm of Chantal Othrair simply faded away as its population dwindled, and its people departed for other lands, leaving behind only ruins to mark where a proud kingdom once stood. The pattern suggests that elven kingdoms, regardless of their specific approach to governance or interaction with other races, seem vulnerable to decline over time. This could imply that elven longevity, often considered a strength, creates certain weaknesses in their civilizations. The very immortality that allows individual elves to accumulate vast knowledge and skill may also lead to cultural stagnation, as generations fail to bring the renewal that shorter-lived races experience naturally. You stand now in the ruins of Myth Draenor, picking your way through rubble that was once magnificent buildings, past fountains that no longer flow and gardens that have become overgrown tangles of thorns. The mythal still functions after a fashion, but its corrupted influence makes the ruins more dangerous than ordinary wilderness would be. Creatures twisted by dark magic lurk in shadowed chambers. Undead haunt buildings where they once lived. Demonic entities remain bound to locations they claimed during the siege, unable to leave, but waiting eternally for new victims to torment. Yet even in ruin, Myth Draenor holds treasures beyond price. The city's libraries were burned, but some books survived in sealed vaults or hidden caches. The academies were destroyed, but their research notes and experimental results might still be recovered. Magic items created by Myth Draenor's finest craftsmen lie scattered through the ruins, waiting for adventurers brave or foolish enough to claim them. The knowledge and artistry of 700 years of unprecedented cooperation did not vanish entirely when the city fell. Fragments remain, waiting to be found. The ruins have been partially reclaimed multiple times over the centuries since the fall. Various groups have attempted to resettle Myth Drannor, to drive out the dark forces and restore the city to something resembling its former glory. Most of these attempts failed quickly, with the would-be settlers killed or driven away by the dangers lurking in the ruins. A few achieved temporary success, clearing out portions of the city and establishing defensible enclaves, but none managed to hold their gains for more than a few years. The dream of Myth Drannor refuses to die completely. New generations of idealists look at the ruins and see not failure but possibility. They believe that what was achieved once might be achieved again, that the vision of racial harmony and cooperation deserves another chance. Some work toward restoring Myth Drannor itself, planning elaborate expeditions to reclaim the ruins section by section. Others seek to create new cities inspired by Myth Drannor's example, building fresh rather than trying to resurrect the past. The price of idealism, as Myth Drannor demonstrates, can be catastrophically high. The city's founders and residents believed deeply in their vision of racial cooperation and harmony. They were willing to challenge ancient traditions and face fierce opposition from their own people to pursue that vision. They succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations, creating a society that functioned peacefully and productively for over 7 centuries. Yet in the end, their idealism made them vulnerable. They could not imagine that evil would organize as effectively as they had, could not conceive that their enemies would set aside mutual hatred to focus on destroying what goodness had built. Whether this means the experiment was worthless remains an open question. 700 years of beauty and harmony represent a substantial achievement. Generations of people who lived better lives because of the vision Eltargrim pursued. The knowledge and innovations that emerged from Myth Drannor continue to influence the world. Based on the evidence, we can infer that the city's legacy extends beyond its physical existence, living on in the countless individuals and communities it inspired. That the dream ended in tragedy does not necessarily negate the value of what was accomplished while it endured. Section 5. Giants, dragons, and powers beyond memory. The mountains rise before you like the bones of the world itself, peaks that scrape the sky and valleys so deep that sunlight never reaches their floors. You climb ancient stairs carved into living rock, each step worn smooth by countless feet over countless millennia. These stairs were not made for beings of your size. Each rise comes up to your waist, forcing you to scramble and pull yourself upward. The beings who built this staircase were giants, and everything around you reflects their scale and their power. Astoria, the empire of the giants, predates every human civilization you have encountered in your studies. When the first humans were learning to make fire and shape crude tools from stone, the giants already ruled a kingdom that stretched from the spine of the world mountains to the shores of the trackless sea. They built monuments that still stand after 40,000 years. They created weapons that function perfectly despite ages of neglect. They established a social order so deeply ingrained that their descendants maintain it even now, even in their reduced and scattered circumstances. The giants were not always the disparate and often hostile tribes you know today. Once, they were unified under a single empire, ruled by the greatest among them in a hierarchy based purely on strength and capability. The storm giants, most powerful and intelligent of all giant kind, occupied the highest positions. Below them ranked the cloud giants, then the fire giants, then the frost giants, then the stone giants, and finally the hill giants at the bottom of the social ladder. Each type of giant had their place, their role, their purpose within the greater structure. The system worked because everyone accepted it as natural and right. Astoria's capital was a city called Vonenheim, built in the spine of the world mountains at a location that has never been conclusively identified. The city supposedly contained structures so massive that clouds formed inside the largest buildings. Towers rose miles into the air, visible from distances of hundreds of miles. The palace of the giant king was said to be larger than many human cities, with throne rooms that could accommodate thousands of giants simultaneously. Everything in Vonenheim was built to a scale that makes human architecture seem like children's toys by comparison. The giants possessed magic, but their approach to spellcasting differed fundamentally from how other races practiced it. Giant magic was instinctive rather than studied, tied to their elemental natures rather than learned from books or taught by masters. A fire giant could command flames because fire was part of their essential being, not because they had memorized specific spell formulae. A storm giant controlled lightning and wind through natural ability rather than arcane training. This made giant magic less versatile than wizard spellcasting, but more reliable and often more powerful within its specific domain. Giant craftsmanship achieved heights that most modern smiths and artisans cannot match. The giants forged weapons from metals that no longer exist or that cannot be worked with current techniques. They carved stone with a precision that seems impossible given the scale at which they worked. A giant forged sword might be 20 feet long and weigh more than an ox, but its balance would be perfect, and its edge would hold sharpness for millennia. Giant armor, even rusted and damaged, provides protection superior to anything human smiths can create. The giants also kept slaves, capturing members of smaller races and forcing them to serve. Humans, elves, dwarves, all were fair game for giant raiding parties. These slaves performed tasks that giants considered beneath them, or that required fine manipulation that giant-sized hands could not achieve. The treatment of slaves varied depending on which type of giant held them. Storm giants were relatively benevolent masters who provided decent conditions. Hill giants were brutal, working their slaves to death and replacing them with fresh captives, regardless of the variation. Slavery under giants was always fundamentally dehumanizing, reducing sentient beings to property. The fall of Astoria came not from external conquest, but from internal division. The carefully maintained hierarchy that had held the empire together for thousands of years began to crack as different giant types developed conflicting interests and philosophies. The storm giants grew increasingly isolated, withdrawing to remote mountain peaks and island fortresses where they could pursue their studies in solitude. The cloud giants became obsessed with wealth and luxury, caring more about accumulating treasure than maintaining the empire. The fire giants focused on martial power, building armies and weapons, but losing sight of larger strategic goals. The conflicts started small, disputes over territory or resources that escalated into violence. But once giant kind began fighting among themselves, the violence grew exponentially. When giants go to war, the landscape itself is transformed. Mountains are leveled or raised by hurled boulders the size of houses. Valleys are carved by supernatural storms called down by warring storm giants. Forests burn for months when fire giants march through them. The wars among the giant races devastated the territories they fought over, making them uninhabitable even for the victors. The dragons watched as Astoria tore itself apart, and they saw opportunity. Dragons had always competed with giants for dominance. Two ancient races of tremendous power locked in endless rivalry, with the giants divided and weakened by civil war. The dragons launched coordinated attacks on giant settlements across the northern realms. The giants, fighting among themselves, could not mount unified defense. Dragon flights razed cities that had stood for 10,000 years. Giant populations were slaughtered or scattered as refugees. By the time the giants realized their mistake, by the time they understood that their internal conflicts were destroying them more effectively than any external enemy could, it was too late. Astoria shattered into dozens of smaller territories controlled by different giant clans. The unified empire that had once seemed eternal became a memory, something the giants recalled with mixture of pride and shame. The social hierarchy remained, but it became something each clan maintained separately rather than a force, unifying all giant kind. The ruins of Astoria dot the northern landscapes like broken teeth. You find carved stones protruding from glaciers, stairs leading nowhere through mountain passes, foundations of buildings so large that entire villages could be built within their perimeters. These ruins are dangerous to explore, not because they contain active defenses or magical traps, but simply because of their scale. A ceiling that collapses in a giant structure drops enough stone to bury an entire party of adventurers. Staircases that seem stable can give way after 40,000 years of weathering, sending explorers plummeting down drops that would be merely inconvenient for giants, but fatal for humans. Yet treasure awaits those brave enough to seek it. Giant hoards often remain intact in sealed chambers, protected by the sheer weight of stone doors that no human could move without magic. Weapons and armor sized for giants can be melted down for their valuable metals, or studied for their superior craftsmanship. Ancient texts recorded in the giant language reveal history and lore that no other sources preserved. The giants wrote in stone rather than on parchment, carving their records into walls and pillars. And stone endures where paper would have crumbled to dust ages ago. While the giants fought their civil wars in the north, other ancient powers rose and fell across Faerûn. The twin empires of Narfel and Ramathar engaged in a magical conflict so devastating that it left vast territories uninhabitable for thousands of years. These northern kingdoms, contemporary with early Netheril, practiced forms of magic that modern wizards consider too dangerous to attempt. Narfel built its power on demon binding, summoning fiends from the abyss, and enslaving them to serve the Empire's purposes. The Nar wizards developed techniques for controlling these chaotic beings, binding them into service through complex rituals and magical contracts. Demon-bound soldiers fought Narfel's wars. Demon-powered constructs worked in Narfeli workshops. The Empire's entire infrastructure depended on the forced labor of beings whose nature was destruction and chaos. This approach gave Narfel tremendous military power, but it was fundamentally unstable. Demons are patient, and they never truly accept bondage. Ramathar took a different path, focusing on elemental magic and the binding of spirits from the inner planes. Where Narfel trafficked with the abyss, Ramathar drew power from the raw elemental forces of fire, water, earth, and air. Ramvaran wizards created elemental servants that were less inherently destructive than demons, but equally powerful when properly commanded. The rivalry between these two empires was inevitable. Two magical philosophies in direct competition for dominance over the northern territories. The war between Narfel and Ramathar lasted for generations, with both sides escalating their magical attacks to ever more devastating levels. The Nar wizards summoned greater and more powerful demons. The Ramvarans responded by calling forth elemental catastrophes. Cities were destroyed, populations annihilated, and vast tracts of land were transformed into cursed wastelands by the magical energies unleashed. The conflict reached its climax when both empires attempted simultaneous apocalyptic rituals designed to destroy their enemy completely. The result was mutual annihilation. Both rituals succeeded and both failed. Narfel and Ramathar were destroyed in the same moment, consumed by the very powers they had tried to control. The demons the Nar had bound broke free and rampaged across the shattered empire before returning to the abyss. The elementals summoned by Ramathar went wild, their controlling bindings severed, and they scoured the land clean of life. What remained of both empires was wasteland, territory so saturated with residual magic that it remains dangerous to this day. The lesson of Narfel and Ramathar echoes as a warning about the dangers of binding powers beyond your control. Both empires achieved great heights through their magical practices, commanding forces that made them among the most powerful nations of their age. Yet their reliance on bound servants proved their undoing. Based on what remains in their ruins, we can infer that neither empire truly controlled the powers they claimed to master. They merely held them in check temporarily. And when those bonds failed, the backlash destroyed everything they had built. To the south, the empire of Jamdath rose along the shores of the Vilhan Reach, ruled by wizard kings who commanded magic that rivaled the Netherese in some respects. The Jamdathan approach to magic emphasized control over water and weather, appropriate for a maritime empire whose power was projected primarily through naval forces. Their ships sailed seas that their wizards had calmed. Their armies struck coastal targets, while magical storms protected them from counterattack. Jamdath's arrogance matched their power. The wizard kings believed themselves invincible, protected by their mastery of the seas and the magical wards that defended their cities. They conducted slave raids against coastal settlements, capturing populations and forcing them into bondage. Among those they enslaved were a race of aquatic beings called the Ixixatchitl, creatures that dwelt in the deep waters and possessed their own forms of magic. The Ixixatchitl endured enslavement for generations, but they did not forget. They organized in the depths beyond Jamdathan's surveillance, gathering their forces and preparing for revenge. When they struck, they did so with coordination and fury that the Jamdathans had not anticipated. The Ixixatchitl attacked from below, breaching harbor defenses and flooding coastal cities. Jamdathan wizards discovered that their magic, so effective against surface threats, was far less useful against enemies who attacked from the ocean depths. The war was brief but devastating. Within a decade, Jamdath was destroyed, its cities drowned beneath waves that the Ixixatchitl pulled over them. The wizard kings who had seemed so powerful were revealed as vulnerable, their defenses optimized for threats they expected rather than the one they faced. The lesson parallels that of Amaskar in many ways. Enslaving others, regardless of how powerful you believe yourself to be, creates enemies who will eventually find your weaknesses and exploit them. Far to the south, the ancient empire of Kalimshan represents a different pattern of rise and fall. Kalimshan was founded not by humans, but by genies, powerful beings from the elemental planes, who established a kingdom on the material world. The Jinn and Efreet who ruled Calamshan used humans as servants and playthings, treating them as the giants treated their slaves, but with even less regard for their welfare. Over thousands of years, human slaves in Calamshan gradually gained power and influence. They learned magic from their genie masters, accumulating knowledge and capability across generations. Eventually, humans grew strong enough to rebel, overthrowing their genie overlords and claiming Calamshan for themselves. But the empire they inherited was built on foundations of cruelty and oppression, and those foundations shaped human Kalashite culture in lasting ways. Calamshan endured for thousands of years under human rule, but it never achieved the stability of Mulhorand or the glory of Netheril. The empire fragmented and reunified multiple times, torn apart by internal conflicts and reconquered by ambitious leaders. It was invaded repeatedly by neighboring powers who coveted its wealth and strategic location. Calamshan demonstrates that even when a civilization survives for millennia, survival is not the same as thriving. The empire persists in some form to your current day, but it is a pale shadow of what the genies built. And even that original glory was founded on the suffering of slaves. Lesser-known civilizations also rose and fell, leaving only fragmentary records. The Saruk, serpent folk who created the Nether Scrolls in an age before elves walked Faerûn, built an empire whose full extent and capabilities remain mysterious. The Batraki, a race of amphibious beings, ruled vast territories before some catastrophe destroyed them so thoroughly that most scholars doubt they ever existed. The eerie avian beings who built cities in the clouds long before Netheril vanished, leaving only ruins atop the highest mountains. Each of these fallen civilizations left its mark on the world. Their ruins draw adventurers seeking treasure and knowledge. Their magic items appear in hoards and hidden caches, valuable relics of greater ages. Their blood flows in the veins of modern peoples, creating the racial diversity that characterizes your world. Their mistakes serve as warnings about the paths that lead to destruction. Their achievements inspire wonder and ambition in those who study their legacies. You need to understand what these fallen empires mean for your own adventures. When you venture into ancient ruins, you are not simply exploring old buildings. You are investigating the remains of civilizations that shaped the world you inhabit. Every dungeon has a history. Every artifact comes from a specific time and place. Every monster guarding treasure might be a creature created by ancient mages or an entity bound to service thousands of years ago and still carrying out its orders. The magic you use, the spells you cast, almost certainly have roots in one of these lost civilizations. Modern spellcasting is built on foundations laid by Netherese arcanists, Imiskari artificers, or Narfeli demon binders. The techniques have been refined and simplified, made accessible to less powerful wizards than those ancient empires produced. But the core principles remain the same. When you study magic, you are learning knowledge that has been passed down through countless generations from sources that no longer exist. The political structures of modern nations often mirror or react against patterns established by these fallen empires. Kingdoms that emphasize equality and justice may be consciously rejecting the rigid hierarchies of Astoria or Mulhorand. Realms that fear magic and restrict wizards might be responding to memories of how Nethril or Narfell were destroyed by arcane excess. Nations that welcome multiple races are either inspired by Myth Drannor's example or determined not to repeat its mistakes. The lesson you should draw from these fallen empires is not that greatness inevitably leads to collapse, though that pattern certainly exists. The lesson is that choices have consequences that ripple forward through time. The Imiscari chose to enslave others and wall out the gods. That choice destroyed them. The Netherese chose to pursue power without limits. That choice brought catastrophe. The giants chose internal conflict over unity. That choice shattered their empire. Myth Drannor chose idealism over pragmatism. That choice left them vulnerable to coordinated evil. Narfell and Ramathar chose to bind powers they could not truly control. That choice led to mutual destruction. Yet these empires also chose to build wonders, to pursue knowledge, to attempt things that had never been attempted before. They chose to reach for heights that seemed impossible, and sometimes they succeeded. For centuries or millennia, they achieved greatness that made them the envy of their age. Their ultimate falls do not negate their achievements. Both the glory and the ruin are part of their legacy, and both deserve to be remembered. Standing here in ruins that might have belonged to any of these fallen powers, you hold a torch against darkness that has lasted for ages. The flame illuminates carved walls covered in script you cannot read, passages leading deeper into mysteries you may never fully understand, but you press forward anyway because that is what adventurers do. You explore what has been lost. You recover what can be saved. You learn from the past even as you create the future. The world you inhabit is haunted by the ghosts of empires that rose too high and fell too far. Their ruins provide the dungeons you explore, the treasures you seek, the magical items that make you powerful. Their knowledge forms the foundation of modern civilization. Their mistakes serve as warnings to those wise enough to heed them. Their descendants are your companions, your rivals, your neighbors in a world shaped by cycles of rise and fall that stretch back to the dawn of recorded history. Will your civilization learn from these examples? Will modern kingdoms avoid the hubris that doomed Nethril, the cruelty that destroyed Imascar, the division that shattered Astoria, the overconfidence that consumed Jomdeth? Or are you doomed to repeat the patterns, to build high only to fall far, to achieve glory that inevitably transforms into ruin? Only time will answer these questions, but the answers will be written by choices made today by people like you. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten empires of Dungeons and Dragons lore. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the civilizations lost to time, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more mysteries waiting to be explored, endless stories hidden in the ruins of ages past. Until next time, may your adventures lead you to both treasure and wisdom. And may you remember that everything you find was once part of something greater.